Money is something that underpins a huge part of our lives, yet few people understand what it is. This documentary, presented to you by GoldMoneyFuture, will help you understand this amazing phenomenon. Most of us spend 8 hours a day trying to earn money and a great deal of thought in trying to decide how much of our earnings to spend or invest. By the end of this documentary, I can guarantee that you will think about money in a very different manner. We are going to cover a few key concepts, some history, and some sense of scale of the issues that, whether you were previously aware of them or not, dominate your life and the lives of those around you. Finally, you will get some easy steps to take to become much wealthier, if that is what you wish. Yet I also hope that you will join us at GoldMoneyFuture in discussing how we can introduce a new monetary system, and in so doing, make the world a better place. As stated, we are going to learn about 4 key concepts to help us understand money and its future. The first key concept is the relationship between the debtor and the creditor. The second key concept is the question of what money is. The third is what is power, and this is in itself a fascinating question. The last and most important concept is the exponential function. Let's get started. The first key concept is the relationship between the debtor and the creditor. The debtor is someone who wants something, a good or a service, and the creditor is the person who needs to decide whether or not to give it. The word creditor is based on the Latin word credo, which means I believe. The creditor needs to believe in whatever the debtor is willing to pay, and therefore the debtor needs the confidence and the trust of the creditor. Equally, the creditor needs to be realistic about what the debtor is able to return. The two sides have a mutually binding relationship. The debtor-creditor relationship is the basis of human collaboration, and a key reason why the human race has advanced so far. Key concept number 2. What is money? Money is a quantifiable unit of debt or credit. What is good money depends on whether you are the debtor or the creditor. A creditor prefers hard money, a tangible object such as a pound of iron or a sheep. A debtor is most happy with soft money, an intangible asset such as a promise of a favour at some undisclosed point in the future. Much of what we are going to learn about is the historic battle between debtors and creditors and the concept of money bouncing between hard and soft units of account. The third key concept is what is power? And this is in itself a fascinating question. Power is the ability to influence other people. The main source of power is the ability to communicate knowledge and violence. Neither creditors nor debtors are inherently more powerful than each other. Instead, it is fair to say that debtors and creditors fall into either one of 2 categories, strong and weak. Because we are used to thinking in terms of modern-day currencies, we will use the examples of countries. Some debtors are powerful, like the USA, and some are weak, such as Greece. Some creditors are powerful, like China, and some are weak, such as Vietnam. The relationship between those who are powerful and weak and those that are debtor and creditor are entirely subject to change. This is a crucial issue that you should try to become more aware of in your own life, as well as in watching and analysing world events. The last and most important concept is the exponential function. The exponential function occurs with any regular percentage growth over a given length of time. Whilst the rate of change stays the same, the amount of change does not. Here we have a graph of a certain unit, of which there are only a few thousand, 12,000 years ago. This particular unit grew at an average of just 1% over 12,000 years. At first, there is almost no noticeable change for not just the first 2,000 years, or the next 2,000 years, or even the first 10,000 years. But then, after 10,000 years, a turning point happens. And then, in the last 1,000 years, bam! All the action happens at once. Whilst the percentage increase stayed at a steady 1%, the amount of change moved into the tens of millions. This graph is in fact world human population. If you find this difficult to believe, that's okay. It's why Dr. Bartlett states, the greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. Let's look at the relationship between the human race timeline and the journey of money between hard and soft units of account. We have spent most of our existence in tribes, in hunter-gatherer cultures. This timeline is clearly not to scale, because if it was, then it would have to start several meters to the left of your screen. Next came agriculture and ancient civilizations, then the Romans, then the Middle Ages, then the Renaissance times, and then the modern times. If it seems like history is speeding up, that is because it is. Technology is also subject to the exponential function, and the amount of technological change is growing ever faster. This is a key point, because changes that used to occur over thousands of years could later be made in centuries and now just a few years. The chart that you see is the story of money, and the one that we are about to spend some time looking at. We will look at the development of money in the different stages of the story of the human race. Most of human existence has been based around the tribe. Sadly, there are only a few tribal cultures left today, and they are incredibly important as they serve as reminders of what we as humans are like. They are essentially extended family units. General credit arrangements are the norm. It is a myth that monetary systems was based around barter. Instead, if you consider your own family, the individual members look out for each other and will provide goods and services as favours. It is important that these favours are not taken for granted, as this will upset the harmony of the family. A debt-based monetary system is fine, so long as no one runs up too much debt with the other members of the community, because eventually the creditors of the community will no longer accept promises as money, but rather will demand tangible goods. Barter did, however, occur when one tribe would come across another. In this occasion, a mildly competitive exchange of goods and services might take place. The only problem being is that this exchange suffers from what is termed mutual coincidence of needs. In order for it to work, one individual might own a necklace, and another person may own a chicken, and both be willing to swap. If this coincidence did not happen, then no financial transaction could take place, and this is clearly an incredibly inefficient system. This is why there are two lines on the money chart for this period, and the one at the top, the hard money line, is the thinner of the two. The next stage of the human story is that of ancient civilizations. Clearly, the advent of agriculture is incredibly important, but then so was the new concept of money. Money became a unit of account that was accepted by everybody within the financial system, and so the creditor had the confidence that he could use the money to purchase a good in the future. Money was a massive leap forwards because it allowed financial interaction between individuals who did not know each other previously. It allowed, therefore, for much larger communities. In short, it made civilization possible. Here we can see on our money chart that the debt and barter forms of monetary system have converged. We know from their hieroglyphics that Egyptians used wheat as a base unit of account, although they used tablets to record this debt. These tablets could then be used as money. The Babylonians, however, had a similar monetary system based on barley and even beer, and this is clearly a monetary system that would appeal to many of the guys who are watching this documentary. Amongst both cultures, gold and silver were highly valued and would be readily acceptable as a method of payment. In the 6th century BC, all three of the great civilizations made massive developments. Mathematicians such as Pythagoras in the West, Buddha in India, and Confucius in China brought enlightenment to their cultures, including what has been termed as the Golden Rule: do to others what you would like to be done to yourself. Interestingly, at this time, gold and silver had both, by process of elimination, been proved to be the best forms of money. Why is that? For a few reasons. 1. They could be coined and were easy to count. 2. They were widely acceptable means of exchange. 3. They acted as a store of value and did not rot or die, unlike wheat or animals. 4. They were small and easy to transport and identify. 5. They were easy to store. 6. They were hard to counterfeit. 7. They look nice and shiny and people feel instinctively drawn to them. However, it is undeniable that there is a relationship between war and gold. Firstly, creditors feel nervous about handing out credit to people who may not be around at the end of the week. They want hard money only. Secondly, everybody wants hard money as it provides liquidity in an unpredictable time. Alexander the Great knew this and made the drachma of pure silver under his silver standard. Interestingly, he set the ratio of gold to silver at 1 to 10, which happens to be the natural occurrence ratio between them. Nevertheless, he had to pay his armies half a ton of silver a day, and this required him to keep conquering more and more land. A purely hard currency can only logically work if the army stayed in one place and gained the trust of the local population, who agreed to respect their property rights and return goods and services in return for the hard money. This is why Alexander was sure to set rules for the cities he founded. These lessons were not lost on the Romans. Their currency, the denarii, was also originally made of pure silver. They were also keen to enforce the rule of law and property rights. Here we can see on the money chart that money had hit the top of the cycle. As we all know, the Roman Empire grew and flourished in terms of science, culture, military strength, and the economy. However, the government wished to pay for more projects than they had collected in taxes, and wished to spend on impressive buildings such as the Grand Colosseum. This deficit spending was not applauded by all the ministers. Indeed, Cicero commented, "The budget should be balanced, the treasury should be refilled, public debts should be reduced, the arrogance of officialdom should be tempered and controlled, the assistance of foreign lands should be curtailed. Lest the republic become bankrupt, people must again learn to work instead of living on public assistance." It should be clear that whilst technology can change rapidly, the behaviour of people and politicians have some habits that are constant. However, the emperors had realised the power of seigniorage, that it was the governmental stamp with the face of the emperor that people paid attention to, and did not doubt the silver content of the coin. In fact, the coins were worth more than their silver content. Starting with the Emperor Augustus, a small amount of tin was put in each coin. Whilst clearly this inflated the currency supply, it is not true to say that everyone had become richer. Instead, a larger amount of coins chased the same amount of goods and services. Each coin was worth less, and in time, the public would demand more and more of them in return for their goods and services. Each successive emperor then felt compelled to further debase each coin to get the same amount of goods and services. In this graph, we can clearly see the decline in the silver content of each denarii. The road to hyperinflation is a well-trodden one. Firstly, the government spends more than its means. Secondly, it debases the currency to make up the difference. And thirdly, the people eventually no longer say credo. They no longer believe in the currency. By the end of the 3rd century AD, the denarii was worth just 10% of its former self. Neither the peasants, workers, or soldiers were willing to do their jobs in return for the worthless denarii, and the Roman Empire collapsed. For those who believe that improvements in technology will be the all-conquering solution to the debt problems of the West, it is worth remembering that it took over 1,000 years for the Western civilization to recover from the debasement of the Roman monetary system. Here we can see on the money chart, money has dropped in the cycle. Not to the bottom, as the coins were still tangible pieces of metal with a little bit of silver, but clearly worth much less. From now on, the public would demand that coins were made of pure silver and gold, and the rulers would enjoy very little seigniorage in their coins. In the Middle Ages, King Alfred the Great coined his silver shillings, 20 of which weighed £1, and this is where we get the name pound sterling, as in £1 of sterling silver. In the Middle East, the rise of Muhammad and Islam brought the stabilizing effect of the gold dirham and the silver dinar. In the East, the new superpower of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire used the silver emblem. But later, in Italy, in the 14th century, the Medici family, who owned a deposit bank, realized that not once did all of their depositors come to redeem their receipts for all of their gold and silver on the same day. Even better, their notes of receipt were traded in the marketplace as if they were the gold and silver themselves. Therefore, they realized that they could in fact hand out more receipts than they had gold and silver on deposit. Indeed, they only needed to hold on to a fraction of the gold and silver that they had handed out receipts for, and thus we get the phrase and concept of fractional reserve banking. These extra receipts could then be loaned out to businessmen in need of capital, who would then be charged interest on their fraudulent receipts, the calculations of which became much easier with Fibonacci's introduction of Arabic numerals into Europe only a few years earlier. If you understand the exponential function, it will become obvious why the Medici family became incredibly rich. On the money chart, you will notice that we have bounced off the top of the hard money line on a heading back down the cycle. And now, for the most important event in history. It is one that has gone almost entirely unnoticed, even by expert historians. In 1694, the King of England, King William II if you are interested, found himself at war with France. Like many kings, princes and presidents, he found out that wars are often longer, harder and more expensive than they had hoped for. He needed more money. So a group of wealthy bankers, led by a man called William Paterson, invented the world's greatest business deal. They invented the Bank of England, of which they were the owners. They would lend the king £1.2 million for the war and his other expenses, and he would never have to pay them back. The catch? He would pay 8% interest on his loan in paper receipts, and would pass a law stating that these papers could be used amongst the public. Indeed, the papers would be loaned out to the public again at interest. In short, bankers would receive interest in two directions, and the bankers, because of the exponential function, were guaranteed to become stupendously wealthy given enough time. But would the public go along with the deal? Well, yes. Firstly, one of the clauses of the deal was that the king would accept the bank paper in taxes, so the public had to earn the banknotes by working for them. But would the public trust the banknotes? Well, yes, because printed upon the note was a promise to pay the bearer a sum of gold. In its vaults, the Bank of England held a great deal of gold and silver, and £5 would buy 1 gold ounce sovereign. But they could create much more paper receipts than there was gold, just like the Medici had discovered. Within a few years, the public grew bored of swapping the paper notes for gold and accepted the paper to be worthy means of payment. And anyway, they were much more convenient to carry. But what happened to silver? Sir Isaac Newton, more famous as a scientist for his work in gravity, was made master of the mint. He set the ratio of gold to silver at 1 to 16, which is in fact incorrect, and the owners of silver refused to swap at such a rate. Slowly, after some 700 years, silver disappeared from the British monetary system, despite giving its name to the currency of a pound sterling. Despite all of this, we are still left with the conundrum. If each banknote is loaned into existence with debt, and that debt comes with interest, we end up with a situation in which there is always more debt than there is money. How could this ever be paid off? In recap, what we had is a new currency system. At the base of the inverted pyramid was gold. Then there was a far greater amount of central bank created fiat currency paper receipts. Then there was an even greater amount of bank deposits for the public, and this can be called credit. Both the fiat currency and the fractional reserve bank were both Ponzi schemes, always at risk of being toppled if put under enough pressure. Yet the arrangement could keep on growing, providing the public subconsciously believed in the system and were able to produce ever more goods and services to pay off the interest. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a truly astonishing situation in which the people's efforts from 1694 onwards was simply to keep growing the economy in a never-ending attempt to pay off the debt. But there was nothing in the rules that said that all of this had to be done with the resources found at home. A more convenient method was to colonize other areas of the globe, and the British ended up gaining a huge empire both due to and because of their ability to create credit plus interest. Other European countries would follow. As you can see on the money chart, we have slipped a little further down the cycle. Did the gold standard work? Many people look back to the gold standard as a hallowed era of monetary stability. To examine this, we are going to stay focused on the pound. Firstly, because it was the leader in the banking system, but also because Britain was the strongest world superpower. Here is a graph of price stability taken from the UK House of Commons Library report made on the British pound sterling, written in 2006. In the short term, the answer has to be no. Prices could shoot up and down, most notably in the event of a war, such as the one against Napoleon. But the key thing here is that the line closely hugs the 0% line and averages out. But after 1914, with the exception of the Great Depression, the price stayed above the zero line and in positive territory. And if you remember the exponential function, you will be aware that this is bad news. What was it that happened in 1914? Those of you who know your history will know that it was World War I. The government once again needed far more currency to pay for the war and could no longer pretend that it had enough gold to redeem the notes with. Enough pressure was finally applied to the system, and Britain, along with the rest of the European states, came off the gold standard. What would be the effect on inflation? As we can see in this graph, prices stayed basically constant from the period 1750 to 1914 in Britain, and this would be the case even if the chart went back another 50 years or so to 1694. How is this possible with the inevitable growth of the money supply? Well, the huge expansion of the economy under the Industrial Revolution and the building of the British Empire meant that there was more money chasing more goods and services. Proponents of the gold standard usually point to this as evidence that the gold standard is the best of all monetary systems. By modern day standards, it is indeed impressive. Imagine how pleased you would be to have the prices at your local food shop stay still for a few years, let alone a few decades. Yet it is impossible to know what would have been the impact of all these goods and services being created with a fixed money supply. Prices of goods and services would have headed downwards, and I would like you to press pause and consider for a second how much life would be easier if the prices of goods and services always went down. Nevertheless, in reality, after the gold standard was abandoned due to the First World War, inflation took off. Another way of looking at inflation is instead looking at the purchasing power of one individual unit of money. As we can see in this graph, prices stayed pretty constant from 1700 and before, and then after the removal of the gold standard, bam! The purchasing power of the pound collapsed. This may well remind you of the shape of the graph of the Roman denarii, and for good reason. I'd like to bring your attention to a few things. Firstly, this graph is logarithmic and is therefore not to scale. Secondly, it stops in 2006, and since then, the purchasing power of the pound has dropped even further. Amazingly, despite all of this, most people have never thought about the monetary system, and many of them will doubt the validity of this concept when you tell them, and state that the exponential debt-based monetary system is fine and that there is nothing to be concerned about. You can politely explain to them that this story is basically 90% over already, that they have managed to sleep through the greatest robbery of all time, and that they really need to wake up and open their eyes. There is little time left to do anything about it. This brings us on to the topic of hyperinflation. We are going to see a list of modern paper currencies whose purchasing power were destroyed by the phenomenon of hyperinflation. To recap, there is a well-trodden path to hyperinflation, and it involves 3 stages. Firstly, the government spends more than it takes in revenue, and secondly, it attempts to make up the difference by debasing the money supply. Finally, the people, starting with the smartest and ending with the most gullible, finally stop subconsciously saying credo. They no longer believe in the currency. I would like you to keep an eye on the timeline at the top, and you will notice that, like so many of the other issues we have covered, that at first there is not very much action, and then bam, it all happens at the end. The first on our list is the US Continental. In their efforts to beat the British in the War of Independence, the Americans had run up a huge bill that could not be paid off. They printed the paper money to pay for their debts, and confidence in the US's first dollar collapsed. The second on our list was the French assignat. King Louis XVI ran up a huge bill, and even after they cut off his head, the revolutionary government continued to run up the bill and attempted to print the difference. The currency was finally scrapped by Napoleon, who introduced his solid gold franc. For the rest of the 19th century, all of the major powers were on some version of the gold standard, with the exception of the Confederate dollar. When the South tried to fund their war effort with paper money printing, there was no other hyperinflations in the whole century. In fact, in the first 2 centuries of this story, there were just 3 hyperinflations. Then came the First World War, however. It consumed the efforts of the great nations, and many had run up huge deficits in trying to fight it. Then they tried to pay off these bills by printing paper money. First was the Austrian kronen, then the Russian ruble, then the Polish marek, the Hungarian koruna, the German Reichsmark, and the mark of the Free City of Danzig. Things stabilized for a while, and some countries attempted to get back on some version of the gold standard. But then there was the Second World War. The Japanese destroyed the Philippine peso, then there was the Greek drachma, the Hungarian forint, the Taiwanese yuan, and the Chinese gold yuan. Then it was the turn of Latin America, starting with the Brazilian real, the Argentinian peso, the Mexican peso, the Bolivian peso, the Nicaraguan peso, the Peruvian intis, and then off to Africa for Zaïre's nouveau. You will have noticed that the frequency of the hyperinflations is speeding up. With the collapse of communism, there was the Polish zlotych, the Yugoslavian dinar, the Romanian lei, the Angolian kwanza, the Bosnian dinara, the Serbian dinar, the Ukrainian karbovantsiv, the Georgian kupenlari, the Belarusian ruble, and finally the Zimbabwean dollar. If it seems like the number of hyperinflation events is speeding up, there is good reason for that. They are. So then, It should be clear by now that hyperinflation is not just a theoretical possibility. Instead, it is the predetermined destination of any paper currency. That is because the exponential growth required will always convince the government that they need to run up a deficit, debase the money supply to make up the difference, and the people eventually will stop believing. Now, many people find solace in the idea that this could not possibly happen to an important currency, let alone the mighty US dollar. They would argue all these previous examples are small, weak countries and therefore don't count. This view is made all the more comforting given that almost every single one of these currencies were replaced by a new currency that was in some way backed by the US dollar. It is also the world's reserve currency. Given that the view that the US dollar cannot be a victim of hyperinflation is currently held by the vast majority of people, we must spend some time considering the validity of this argument. We will not point out that the US has already suffered two hyperinflations, as we want to give the argument a fighting chance. Instead, we will look into the history of this current US dollar and see how it works. When the Founding Fathers set about writing the Constitution of the United States in 1787, they were deeply aware of the dangers of paper money. Indeed, it was so important to them that in Article 1, Section 10, they wrote, "No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts." Indeed, on the subject of fractional reserve banks, one of the Founding Fathers, Thomas Jefferson, wrote to a friend, "I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity in the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale." Nevertheless, a central bank is so irresistible to both politicians and financial elites, a group of bankers led by JP Morgan hatched a plan to set up a central bank in secret on Jekyll Island in 1910, and on Christmas Eve, 1913, the Federal Reserve was created. Most people are unaware that the Federal Reserve Bank is not federal, has no reserves, and is not even a bank. They are also under the impression that it is owned in some way by the government and therefore the people, and this is a real shame. If you want to help make the world a better place, telling other people about this rather straightforward yet little known fact would be really helpful. Nevertheless, whilst we are here, we should look at how the central bank fiat monetary system works. What is interesting about the US system is that it follows exactly the same rules as almost any other central bank fiat monetary system. Firstly, the US government needs to fund its deficit, and it does so by the Treasury issuing a bond. It gives this bond to the banking group which owns the Federal Reserve, and at this point the Federal Reserve can create a dollar. The two are swapped in what is termed and ironically phrased as an open market operation. The bond then goes to the Federal Reserve. To simplify then, the Treasury creates the bond and the Fed creates the dollar and they swap them. The Treasury is now able to spend its dollar via the government, and this is done so through the banking system. The fractional reserve banking system requires that they only hold on to a fraction of the paper money, and so the next layer of banks can multiply the amount of credit and the process can be repeated. Finally, the credit appears in the loan deposit accounts of the general public. And this is the currency supply. What most people do not understand is that usually only around 10% of money is the actual physical paper. 90% of the money is just credit numbers on a computer screen. When you get a loan for a house or a car, neither you nor the bank had the money. Instead, the bank simply wrote the numbers into the computer and you can see them on the screen. Whilst this is incredibly hard to accept, it is true. But what gives all these numbers value? Well, the answer is you. Because you believe in those numbers, you are willing to work for them. Your time, effort, blood, sweat and tears give these numbers value. But sadly, it does not end there. You then pay taxes, which, if you are an American citizen, will be collected by the IRS, and this money then goes to the Treasury. And then the Treasury can pay off the original bond for the loan of the banknote that was simply printed out of thin air. But sadly, it does not end there either. There is still the small matter of the interesting problem. The original bond came with a small amount of interest, and so did each and every subsequent bank loan. We can only pay off this debt by earning money from the current currency supply, which will, by design, be less than the amount of debt in existence. This astonishing situation caused Robert Hemphill of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta to comment at the end of his career, "This is a staggering thought. We are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If banks create ample synthetic money, we prosper. If not, we starve. We are absolutely without a permanent money system. When one gets a complete grasp of the picture, the tragic absurdity of our hopeless position is almost incredible. But there it is. You see, if we try and pay off the debt, we destroy the money. That is why a bad economy is one in which we pay the debt off, whilst a good economy is one in which we create more debt. What keeps every central banker in the world up at night is a fear of an attempt by the public to pay off their debts, and this is why it is called a depression. If everybody attempted to do this, we would end up wiping out all of our money, but would still be left with a huge pile of debt. You can research the topic for years, but you will never find an answer to this question. The reason being is because it is logically impossible. However, the central banker sleeps well at night because he knows that if the general public does attempt this, and occasionally they do, he will simply print money faster. With this knowledge, we can view both economics and the history of the 20th century in a very new light, especially for the USA. After the First World War, and later again in the Second World War, the great European powers were knocked off the gold standard. At Bretton Woods in 1944, they formally agreed for the last time to tie their currencies, the French franc, the British pound, and the German mark, to name a few of the most important currencies, through the US dollar to gold at the price of $20 for an ounce. As the world's reserve currency, the US banks were now able to create a huge amount of credit. And, like all credit booms, the credit must go somewhere, sometimes real estate, sometimes commodities, and in the 1920s, the hottest asset was the stock market, and this rocketed to incredible new levels. People felt far richer. The only trouble is that no increase in the amount of credit can actually create wealth, only the illusion of wealth, and so each credit boom would be followed by a credit bust. In 1929, there was the Wall Street crash, and this was followed by the Great Depression. As previously discussed, a depression threatens the very existence of the banking system, and thousands of fractional reserve banks went bust when the depositors all attempted to withdraw their funds. As you will remember, they only had a fraction of the paper money they claimed they had. The central bank was then called upon to do what it was created for, to print the necessary amount of money and bail out the bigger banks that owned it. The only obstacle was the promise to redeem gold at $20. Therefore, they convinced President Roosevelt that the problem was that there was not enough money, and to fix the economy, they needed to print more. In 1933, with Executive Order 6102, Roosevelt declared that public ownership of gold to be illegal and that it must be handed over to the government at the price of $20 an ounce. Once it was all collected, in 1934, he announced that gold was now worth $35 an ounce. The gold, of course, had not changed. The dollar had been devalued 40% in just one day. For the next 4 decades, the central bankers fought what was termed by a Swiss banker named Ferdinand Lips as the Gold Wars, in which they attempted to keep the price of gold down at $35 whilst ever increasing the money supply. They did so by repeatedly selling huge quantities of their gold reserves in order to shock the market. Now, any sensible viewer will realize that you cannot keep selling all your gold forever, and that is why Richard Nixon finally had to throw the towel in and in 1971 declared that the US dollar was no longer redeemable for gold. Because all other currencies were linked through the dollar to gold, it is fair to say that the whole world had just embarked on a new monetary system. For the first time in literally thousands of years, money was free from the anchor of gold. Given the number of people who believe that gold should not be part of the monetary system, we shall examine what the effects of this move have been very carefully. As the proponents of this view include almost all of the political and financial elite, and their view is of course important. First of all, we shall look at the issue of government debt, as this is of course what underpins the monetary system in a government debt-based monetary system. At the beginning of the 20th century, the USA had no debt. After the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was the misfortune of the First World War, and the US spent a great deal of money funding her allies as well as fighting. If you are against war in general, you may wish to consider that a purely gold-based monetary system would limit exactly how much a government could spend on a war, and therefore how long it could go to war for. Nevertheless, next came World War II, and the US national debt increased again, and by 1970 it had reached $400 billion. This is a truly incredible amount of money, and we shall be looking at just how much this is later in this documentary. However, after Nixon had abandoned the gold standard, any president could create debt without the fear of being asked to exchange his gold for the dollars he had just created. Could you not simply cut taxes and increase spending? In this situation, why would you hold back from creating ever larger amounts of debt to get the money you wanted to spend? The answer is that you would not. You would just slam on more and more debt. Here we have the US national debt including its projection until 2020. If this graph makes you feel concerned, that is a perfectly natural and sensible feeling. This rate of exponential debt growth is simply not sustainable. There is some good news, however. As JP Morgan once wisely remarked, gold is money and everything else is just credit, for gold acts as the inescapable accountant. Here we have a graph of the base money supply from 1918 to 1935. As you can see, it almost doubled in less than 20 years. But the value of the gold, mainly because of Roosevelt's revaluing of it, matched the value of the money supply for a year or two in 1934 to 1935. You will notice that this chart measures billions. Because of the requirements of an exponential debt-based monetary system that is accelerated by fractional reserve banking, the money supply continued to grow rapidly throughout the 20th century and reached a massive $200 billion by 1990. On top of this, the normalized use of credit cards increased the money supply even further. In 1979 and 1980, there was a terrific spike in the gold price which temporarily exceeded the value of base money. Nevertheless, interest rates were increased and inflation was pronounced dead, and gold dropped and became forgotten. The banking system went on to create a record-breaking credit bubble that blew up in the stock market in the 1980s and 90s, and when this started to slide, even more credit was created, and this blew up into the real estate bubble all over the world. Finally, like all bubbles, in 2008, it burst. Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns were amongst the first casualties. For a while, it appeared that every fractional reserve banker's worst nightmare would entail a deflation in which everyone attempted to pay off their debts. As previously explained, this is not possible and would cause the system to collapse. In true form, a group of bankers led by Henry Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury and previously of Goldman Sachs, as can be seen here, met with the President. Amazingly, despite the fact that base money had grown to the astronomical amount of $700 billion, they managed to convince hapless George Bush Jr. that there was not enough money. The solution, if you can believe it, was to print a truly stunning $1 trillion and hand it over to the banks, Goldman Sachs first. The trusty Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve, stood by to use his printing press. What is genuinely confounding here is the actions and views of Mr. Bernanke. The behaviour of Paulson and the bankers in just wanting more money is easily understood. It is just plain, unembarrassed greed. They had made a fortune gambling by making risky loans for the credit-fueled real estate boom. Now that that particular bubble had burst, they simply wanted $1 trillion so they could start gambling again. Yet Ben Bernanke is a government employee and, whilst clearly well paid, has nothing in particular to gain from these bubbles. The man is well educated by any standard and was even professor at Princeton University. Yet he was selected for the job of chairman of the Federal Reserve because what is clear in all of his lectures and essays is that he clearly does not understand that an increase in the money supply does not make the economy wealthier. It can only give the illusion of wealth. In this case, one does have to have sympathy with the poor guy. For the logical outcome of this view is that all of the financial problems of every citizen in the US, and possibly even the world, could be fixed if only they could be given enough money. Based on an individual experience, this must indeed seem like a reasonable conclusion. Tragically, Ben Bernanke must be at his wit's end, for in his view, he could solve the hardships of hundreds of millions of good honest folk. Indeed, he could make everybody rich merely at the push of a button, if only he was allowed to do so. Given this belief, his self-control must be admired and appreciated by us all, for his restraint in holding himself back must be excruciating. Nevertheless, the stunning rise of base money can be seen on this graph and naturally pushed up the amount of credit card money. Yet here gold comes, the inescapable accountant. Whilst gold has climbed in price significantly, it still needs to reach around $20,000 an ounce in order to reaccount for the base money supply. Nevertheless, this is assuming two things. Firstly, that the base money supply does not go up any further, and this seems like an unreasonable prediction. Secondly, that this gold spike is part of just yet another normal chapter in the credit boom and bust cycle. As can be seen on the money timeline chart, we have clearly reached the bottom of the monetary cycle when $1 trillion can be simply created in one day. Sadly, it seems more likely that the attack on the World Trade Center on 9/11 in 2001 signified that the US was no longer seen as the world's unquestionable superpower. Because whilst clearly a terrible event, it must be admitted that the losers were the US, finance and organized US military. It is also fair to say that given the military strength of the creditor nations, they may well not feel under any compulsion to honor their debts with currency as strong as it is today. As stated in key concept number 3, the question of who is powerful is as interchangeable as the question of who is the debtor and who is the creditor. The competing efforts of the world's central banks in debasing their currencies to gain a temporary export advantage should be a key concern for any interested and responsible citizen. So far, we have covered the topics of cash and credit. There is, however, an area of currency which gets largely overlooked by most money historians, yet deserves your utmost attention. This is the world of derivatives. Whilst the subject of derivatives to the normal person is somewhat ephemeral and gets such little attention in the media, it is easy to imagine it is merely some obscure and specialist form of banking that does not affect real life. It would be wonderful if that was true. A derivative, put simply, is the bet between two parties on the price of a good, but the good itself never changes hands. Its history goes back to Japan with the founding of the Dojima Rice Exchange in 1697. Here, shumai, real rice, could be bought and sold like any other marketplace. Choamai, or book rice, would be bought and sold between parties who had no intention of actually touching the rice itself, but rather wished to bet on its price movement. A bet is nothing new, but if you and I make a bet and you win and I lose, I might well say, sorry, but I don't have the money. Other than complain, there would be little you could actually do to get the money. But here, the exchange stood behind the bet, guaranteeing its payment. In other words, it had guaranteed the credit. Sadly, the world of derivatives might seem ephemeral, and inside experts might reassure us that it spreads risk and all the trades neatly net off against each other. But in 2008, it became clear that this was not the case, and even insurance giants such as AIG were unable to stand behind the exchanges without taxpayer money. That is because the derivative market is worth towards $1 quadrillion. Whilst the world of derivatives may sound so bizarre that they do not matter, the subsequent taxes and inflation caused by the money printing needed to bail out the insurers are very real. So far, we have thrown around words like billion and trillion and now even quadrillion rather easily, and few people have any real concept of what they mean. Some sense of perspective may help here. Here is a $100 note, the highest denomination of the US dollar. And here is 1 million. We still regard this as a lot of money, and it is, but it would fit inside a shopping bag quite easily. And here is $100 million. It fits on a pallet and would weigh around half a ton. Bear in mind that those are stacks of $100 notes. And this is $1 billion. 10 pallets worth of $100 million. You would need a lorry to move this. And are you ready to see $1 trillion? This will really stun you, so please make sure you are sitting down. This is the amount of money that was created at the stroke of a pen in 2008. Amazing, isn't it? If you spent $1 million a day since Jesus was born, you would not have spent $1 trillion by now. But what of the US national debt that is worth over 15 trillion? What does that look like? Here, we have it next to the Statue of Liberty. It has a base of almost 2 football fields. We can only wonder what the Lady of Liberty would make of this demand on future generations of Americans. However, unbelievable though it may sound, the debt of the US does not stop here. For the calculation of the US national debt does not include pensions and medical aid, and these are referred to as unfunded liabilities. How much are they worth? Well, the answer is a titanic $120 trillion. But what does that look like? I'm afraid this will make uncomfortable viewing. Here we have a picture of the Empire State Building on the left, the World Trade Center in the middle, and the Statue of Liberty so tiny in the bottom right. The massive building at the far right of the screen is not a building. It is the USA's unfunded national debt. It is now going up almost $2 trillion a year. Now it must be obvious to any half-sensible person, including Paulson and the bankers, and maybe even to Ben Bernanke himself, that this much debt cannot be paid off via taxation. Even at current ultra-low rates of interest, the strain will become unbearable, let alone when foreign creditors refuse to buy any more debt and the interest rates shoot up. It will, of course, have to be printed. To recap, the road to hyperinflation is a well-trodden path. Step 1 is for the government to deficit spend a large amount of money, and I think we can all agree that this is pretty well covered. Step 2 is for the government to try and patch things up by printing huge quantities of money. Again, I think we can tick this off our list. Step 3 is that the people stop saying credo. They stop believing in the currency. This process has only just started. Given that people tend to have a herding mentality, it seems likely that the final collapse of faith in the dollar will happen en masse in a mad stampede. Will they rush into other paper currencies? Perhaps briefly, but you may be surprised to know that the US's finances are relatively in pretty good shape. The relative debts of countries such as Japan and the UK are actually much worse. With nowhere else to turn, we must admit to ourselves that, just like in the primitive tribe, the like of which we started this story with, a debt-based monetary system is fine, so long as no one runs up too much debt with the other members of the community, because eventually the creditors of the community will no longer accept promises as money, but will rather demand a tangible good. Given the speed with which technology allows us to communicate ideas, the movement back, once again from soft money where the debtors are happy, to hard money where the creditors are happy, will be fast. Really fast. It will not take centuries, not decades, but more likely just years. The aim of GoldMoneyFuture is threefold: education, protection, and planning. The first aim is to educate the general public about what the problem is to do with the monetary system, its history, its size and scale. I hope that you have enjoyed and taken an interest in this documentary. We have covered a lot of history and conceptual thinking. Much of what you have just heard is somewhat incredible, and I encourage you to watch the documentary again with friends and discuss the ideas put forward. The second aim is to encourage people to act now to protect themselves from the greatest wealth transfer in history. How can this be done? Well, buying gold seems like a fairly obvious thing to do. Whilst it may be tempting to outsmart the market by trying to buy options or futures or ETFs or mining stocks, this is flawed logic. Your best course of action is to buy real physical investment-grade gold. But how much gold is there? Over the thousands of years that we have been mining gold, we have now obtained just over 130,000 tons. That's a little under 20 meters cubed. How much is that? Here we can see the tiny cube next to the mountains of paper money debt. In order for gold to play its historic role as money, it will have to command an awesome purchasing power. Many of you may already be aware that gold has risen a great deal in the last decade or so, and you are unable to afford its current price. Well, there is some good news. You may remember that there was another metal that also played an historic role as money. In fact, silver has arguably played a greater historical role than gold as money. Interestingly, the Chinese word for bank means silver house, and it is affordable to almost everyone at its current price. It is around 1/50th the price of gold. But how much is there? Well, 10 times the amount of gold, right? Well, not quite. It has been used as an industrial metal in tiny amounts for photography, technology, computers, phones, solar panels, and a whole host of other industrial goods for decades, and has been largely burnt up. In terms of investment-grade silver bullion, there is in fact only around 1 billion ounces and falling. That is only 1 ounce per 7 people on the planet. If you have only been watching this documentary to learn about how to become wealthy and increase your purchasing power, then here is your answer. buy silver. But make sure you visit our website at GoldMoneyFuture to find out details about how to buy real investment grade silver and how to store it safely. There are many pitfalls awaiting the novice bullion investor. And there you have it. Buy a few ounces of silver and you will be one of the very few people you know who own real money. This will be an incalculable advantage when people stop believing in paper money. You will also be playing a small part in forcing the price of silver up, and this helps because it is the aim of GoldMoneyFuture to do our best in smoothing out the transition back to hard money, as there will inevitably be problems involved in a rapid transition. This brings us to our last goal, planning for the future. Our third goal is to provide a platform whereby experts can put forward calmly thought out, rational monetary system proposals which stand up to the very highest levels of scrutiny across the fields of inductive and deductive logic that will make a better world not in terms of just economics, socially, culturally, and environmentally. These questions need to be put forward by the public who have taken the time to educate themselves about this topic. We look forward to hearing from you in the future and welcome you not just to wealth, but in making the world a better place.